G'day boys and girls, welcome to the Wrap number 30. This is the show. If you are listening, you are part of the resistance. You are a seeker of truth, you're a lover of the light, and you have turned yourself away from the depths of darkness of ignorance. Today, it's going to be a big show. It's a massive show. What we like to do on the Wrap here is...
It's a big show. It's over 400 pounds worth of stuff. They say as he marches down towards the ring.
There's 400 pounds worth of lean, mean fighting machine. And across from me, we've got
deep state actors.
We've got a few lean, mean fighting machines. Across from me is the Ginger Queen. Young Dougal, Cameron Dougal. How you going, mate?
Was that the joke you were saying you were going to do?
No,
before?
it wasn't.
Oh, is that still coming?
It's still coming. Keep going.
Oh, well, I'm pretty good. I got my protein shake, which is my usual beverage of choice, considering the raw power coming out of this side of the table. But it's a big story. It's a deep story that I'm bringing today about the Chinese espionage spy story in Australia, and that's why I got a beer. So I'm going to need that for the story. So you might need one too. So if you're on your way to work, why don't you stop over in the Bottle-O and get yourself a beer as you drive, so long as that's not illegal, but it will lubricate the ears to the story.
It'll lubricate the mouth as well. If you've got a bit of dry mouth, a good beer's a good one. Now, Dougal did mention that I've got a joke. I do have a joke. A podiatrist walks into his building. His receptionist stops him. He says,
Let's get mixed up with podiatrists and paediatrics and orthopedics. I get mixed up.
It's all foot related. Okay, now, the joke works best if you don't interrupt. Podiatrist walks into his building. His receptionist stops him. He says, look, there's a man who thinks that he's a moth and he's in your room. He wants to see it. The podiatrist says, what? And he says, yeah, there's a man who thinks he's a moth and he's sitting in the room right now. He's been here for a while. I don't know how he got in. Anyway, walks into his room and he goes, hello, mate. How can I help you? He goes, I think I'm a moth. He goes, okay, well, that's all very well and good. But he goes, you understand I'm a podiatrist? He goes, yes. He says, so you have mental problems. You need to see a psychiatrist. He goes, I know. He says, and you think you're a moth. You're crazy. He says, I know. He says, well, what the hell are you doing here? He says, well, the light was on.
I think we're going to pick up I think you spoke way too loud into that microphone. But tell us if you laugh out loud.
Anyways, there's more coming. But the way we'd like to kick off this show is we do a little segment called Jumping to Conclusions, paying homage to the wives and girlfriends. And potentially boyfriends as well. I don't know if that's moving with the times or what's happening.
I think the jumping to conclusions is characteristic of the woman.
It's a female domain.
It's a female trait.
It's a female domain. Okay. Well, Dukes has already put the sword out there. And what we like to do is we like to make a rational or an unreasonable statement, and then we decide who's going to have to justify it. Now, before we begin,
Sometimes it's just an interesting statement.
Sometimes it's an interesting statement, but then you have to justify it. Now, we should actually point out the fact that we are one member down. If you're wondering why the voice is so crisp, why the sentences are so sharp and well put together, why all the sentences have a verb, it's because we're actually missing the third amigo, the third Muppet, so to speak, young Andos. The Mandos stick his head in the Sandos Cameron. He's currently on the Gold Coast running amok, I assume.
We called him up the other day when we had our Carnage House meeting. He told us he's got tonsillitis. I said, where are you resting up in your room? No, I'm in the shisha bar. That's the level of intelligence coming out of the Carnage House team. He's been in the shisha bar with tonsillitis.
I'm sure everyone on the Gold Coast will be thanking Andos as he leaves. What a beautiful airport that is up there in North Queensland.
In South Queensland, wouldn't you say?
Central Queensland, towards the border. Anyways, what's your jumping to conclusion, Dukes?
My jumping to conclusion, one that I think you might have something to say about, because I think you might be able to personally verify. I'm saying it, the age of Tinder is over and the age of Hinge is upon us.
Okay. To be honest, I actually don't know much about Hinge, so I'm interested to hear about it. And judging by the way you carry on around here, I assume that you've had plenty of experience on Tinder. I don't know what the success rate is, but I assume around CPI levels.
Consumer Price Index.
Consumer Price Index. I reckon it's around the cash rate.
I don't know what you're saying.
I think it's around 0.75%, according to Philip Lowe. Okay, what I would say for my jumping to conclusion, there's no such thing as decorative pillows. Decorative pillows don't exist.
We're talking about Hinge, bro.
You want to talk about Hinge? Okay.
I mean, what? We're just going to agree. Pillows that aren't used for sleeping suck. You throw them on the floor. And
that wasn't my thing. That wasn't actually the conclusion, if you were listening. The conclusion was not that.
I don't know what a decorative pillow is in that case.
Okay, well, we might as well go through it. A decorative pillow is actually just a cushion. And people have made it up as a means by which to put it on the bed, as if it's appropriate on the bed. But it's not actually a pillow, it's a cushion. Cushions belong on the couch.
That's what I said. Is it the ones you don't use, you throw them on the floor. There's only a couple used that you actually use for sleeping.
I'm saying that's what a pillow is. They are in fact decorative cushions. What people are throwing on the bed.
I'm saying you throw them on the ground.
Yeah, people throw them on the bed first and then throw them on the ground.
I'm saying if you are alpha,
girls throw them on the bed and boys throw them on the ground. That's how you know if you're a man. Is if the first time you see a decorative cushion on the bed, you throw them off.
And you don't pick it back up.
And you don't pick it back.
Despite
it's like putting the toilet seat down. You don't do it.
You don't do it.
You just don't do it. Okay. Well, I'm happy to talk about Hinge versus was it Grindr or Tinder?
I don't know, but I'm not into the same stuff as you.
Okay. Well, I think we should kick it off. Let's get this shindig on the mindy. I'm absolutely exhausted.
Well, look, I've had my exams. I've had one exam today. The reason why I didn't do the rap last night is because this story was taking so much of my time. I've been prioritising CHP over my exam studies, but you know what? It's worth it all for you guys. Like, share and subscribe, Patreon.
Buy the merch.
We did do a merch drop this week. Some pretty good stuff. Shout out to all the people who bought it so far.
Yeah, we're actually almost sold out on a couple of items, so you should get in quickly.
From Spotify. Okay, so what's been happening? This is a big story this week. A lot of people are talking about it. It's even come into my group chats. And if a political story makes it into the group chats, I think it means the people are onto it. Alex is having a look at his mic. You all good?
Yeah. I'm just going to adjust.
I just think it'll probably come through on the recording. Anyway,
that's okay.
So there was a 60-minute story in the Age, Sydney Morning Herald story, but I think the biggest, kind of most explosive, well, they're all the same thing, but it was on 60 Minutes interview, goes for an hour. So the guy called Wang Li Chiang, his kind of English name is William. What do you think that's funny for?
Just when I was in China, my experience with that in China is how they pick their names and stuff like that. I've always found it pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, you're racist. So we had Will, but we'll call him Mr. Wang. He's allegedly defected as from being a Chinese spy, blew his cover, revealed identities of China's senior military intelligence officers in Hong Kong, as well as providing details of how they fund and conduct political interference operations in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Australia. Now, before I go through the rest of that story from Mr. Wang, 60 Minutes also covered a different half of the story, which I'll just go through quickly, which is important and they're connected. Now, Wang Li Chung is saying he has some extra information on this. Now, what this story is there was a luxury car dealer named Nick Zhao who was killed in Melbourne earlier this year in a hotel room. Police don't know how he died. He did come to ASIO, though, last year and told ASIO that he'd been offered $1 million after being approached by a Chinese espionage ring in Melbourne to run for a Liberal Party seat. So he'd been offered $1 million to fund his campaign, and anyway, he refused it, told ASIO a year later, was found dead in his hotel room with kind of no explanation. Scott Morrison said, so then police his death prompted a coroner's inquiry. Scott Morrison said allegations of a plot to plant a Chinese spy in Canberra's parliament are, quote, deeply disturbing, but he wants to avoid, quote, leaping to conclusions in the reference to Carnage House popular segment.
Clearly in reference to Carnage House popular segment.
In a rare public statement, ASIO doesn't make public statements very often. That's the Australian Securities Intelligence Organisation, the Australian Domestic Intelligence Spy Agency.
So would you call it the Australian equivalent of the CIA? Or would you say
I think it's the FBI.
Maybe?
Yeah, so, and then Liberal backbencher Andrew Hastie, former SAS, Secret Service, said he was briefed on Mr. Zhao's death as chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. Quote, it was surreal. It was like something out of a spy novel happening in Melbourne with impunity. Okay, so that happened. Now,
Zhao's gone.
So Zhao's gone. That was pretty sad. We did gloss over it a little bit, but it's not really funny. It's pretty scary. So Wang Liqiang, allegedly defecting Chinese spy, blowing his cover. He's asking for political asylum in Australia. I'm understanding his wife and child already live here. Mr. Wang took his material to ASIO. He has not been granted political asylum yet, and so he took his story to the media. Now, in interviews with The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, 60 Minutes, he revealed some information about how Beijing does. We'll get into that. He's given previously... This is why this story is quite hard to decipher the facts from the fiction, as we often find, trying to find the fake news from the real news. But I'll give you Mr. Zhao and a range of Australian organisations kind of reactions first, and then I'll give you some of China's defence afterwards. But here's what Mr. Zhao's saying. Sorry, Mr. Wang, not Mr. Zhao. Mr. Wang is saying he'd met the head of a deep cover spy ring operating with impunity in Australia. He said he was part of an intelligence operation hidden within a Hong Kong listed company called China Innovation Investment Limited, CIIL. That's probably what I would call a public company if it was a spy network, in something Innovation Investment Limited, which infiltrated Hong Kong's universities and media with pro-Chinese Communist Party operatives who could be activated to counter the democracy movement. He said he had personal involvement in an October 2015 operation to kidnap and abduct the Chinese mainland a Hong Kong bookseller Li Bo, and played a role in a clandestine organisation that also directed bashings or cyber attacks on Hong Kong dissidents. Now, that was a real thing. Several Hong Kong booksellers did get kidnapped and presumably taken to the mainland China. Political dissidents, I think democracy supporters. That was a big story when it happened.
Hong Kong citizens?
I don't know. I believe so. Mr. Wang said that Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping, quotes, infiltrates all countries in areas such as military, business and culture in order to achieve its goal. Now, in talking about Hong Kong, Mr. Wang claims his cover in Hong Kong was as a businessman working for CIIL, China Investment Innovation Limited, which he described as a front company used by various Chinese intelligence agencies and Communist Party officials. His boss, Xiang Xin, was a senior intelligence operative, he said. Wang's main task was coordinating the relationships between his organisation and other intelligence agencies and, quote, collecting information related to pro-independence activists. One of his operations was in Hong Kong universities, where he allegedly brainwashed Chinese mainland students who were studying in Hong Kong to join the the student societies for Hong Kong independence. He would then take that information about the students and their families and give it back to Beijing. And he said he personally organised the kidnapping of Li Bo. Now, a separate section of allegations that he's making about media infiltration, particularly in areas of Asia. So he claimed his organisation had infiltrated Hong Kong media outlets, financing some and planting operatives in others. In Taiwan, Mr. Wang said his intelligence operation was in contact with media executives in order to influence Taiwan's political system as part of a systematic election meddling campaign being waged by Beijing to topple political candidates, including President Tsai Ing-wen, considered hostile to Beijing. He said his operation backed presidential candidate Han Kuo-yu. Quote, this is what Mr. Wang said, "Our work in Taiwan was the most important work of ours, the infiltration into media, temples and grassroots organisations." Mr. Wang said his operation successfully meddled in the, quote, 9-in-1 elections in Taiwan in 2018, leading to victories for pro-Beijing candidates. He says in May he was given a fake South Korean passport in order to commence an operation on the ground in Taipei to influence the 2020 presidential elections with the aim of bringing down President Tsai Ing-wen. Now, he said that. He said previously he didn't really know he was doing like a spy's job. He was just kind of helping the government. He knew he worked for the government, but when he was given a fake South Korean passport, told to change his whole identity, take his wife and kid with him, go and live in Taiwan and influence the Taiwanese election. That's when he packed up his bags and came to Australia.
Right.
So then, one interesting development over the past couple of days has been reported in the last 18 hours is that Taiwanese police have detained at Taiwan's main airport and questioned a Chinese businessman and his wife who are identified by Wang Lichang as the directors of CIIL, and they're currently being held on suspicion of violating the National Security Act. So those two people he identified as working in that front company in Hong Kong have been detained while they're in Taiwan and are now being questioned by Taiwanese authorities.
By consequence of the 60 Minutes report?
Yeah, at least by consequence of Wang Lichang's allegations.
Yeah.
Okay, so ASIO made a public statement from the Director General of Security, Mike Burgess, on the 24th of November, 2 days ago. He said, quote, "The reporting on 960 Minutes contains allegations that ASIO takes seriously." So that's Wang Lichang's allegations taken seriously. And he also said, quote, "Hostile foreign interference continues to pose a real threat to our nation and its security. ASIO will continue to confront and counter foreign influence and espionage in Australia," although he didn't specifically mention China there. Now, China's response to this story. A couple of different angles. A couple of different people responded to it, or organisations. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman in Beijing, Greg Shuang, accused people and media outlets of having, quote, "become seized with imaginary fears." Quote, "They consistently fabricate cases of so-called Chinese spies infiltrating Australia. China follows the principle of non-interference in other affairs." Now, Shanghai police, in the past couple of days, have released a report which identify Mr. Wang as a criminal in China. They released his date of birth as 1993, so he's only, what's that, how many years older? So like 3 years older than you, Alex?
Yeah, so that'd make him pretty close to 26.
So he's 26, 27 right now. And he was involved in this is the Shanghai police report, alleged he was involved in a fraud case in Guangzhou, Fujian in 2015. The statement said in February 19, Wang fabricated a car import business item and committed a 4.6 million RMB, about $1 million Australian dollars, fraud out of someone. Wang was then charged for fraud again in April 2019. Record shows he arrived in Hong Kong on April 10, 2019. Okay, so China's allegation is that he's a fraud, that he's been a fraud previously, and that he's a fraud now and he's escaping this fraud charge in China. Now, the Global Times, which I understand is owned by the Chinese government, wrote an article. When they tweeted the article, the tweet said, "The Sydney Morning Herald's report on hashtag Wang Lichang is riddled with holes and got slapped with the truth. When it comes to reporting on China, Western public opinion is in a crazy era of pushing agendas regardless of facts or logic." That's from the editor-in-chief, Hu Xijin. Now, the article is, quote, "Chinese spy with bunny ears makes a fool of Western media," is what the article's called. Okay, the first thing the article said was it called the Sydney Morning Herald an anti-China newspaper, which I thought was just an interesting note, and we'll come back to that in a little bit later on. It highlights that Wang's only 26 years old, although some Western media say 27, and we'll get to why that's interesting in a second, but I'll just read you some quotes from the article. So it says, "Chinese people would intuitively know that Wang sounds like an opportunistic liar, probably a swindler. Indeed, Shanghai police said on late Saturday evening that Wang is an ex-convict who was previously sentenced to 15 months in prison in 2016 for fraud and put on probation for 18 months. Now the guy's trying to cheat internationally." They also say to work in China's national security establishment, one has to pass a civil service examination. Many hold a graduate or PhD degree or a bachelor's at minimum. A 26-year-old person can only be a novice. How can he hold such an important position? Wang was only 22 years old in 2015 when he was allegedly involved in the Chinese bookseller kidnap. And the article says, even if he was lucky enough to be working in the National Security Department at such a young age, he would probably be in a training or intern program. How can he be involved in the HK bookseller's kidnapping? He said they also said it's extremely rare that a person who works in China's national security establishment have a child as early as 26. It's especially bizarre that both his wife and child live in Australia if he is working for Beijing. They said if Australia's intelligence agency really believed Wang, it would have taken secret counter-espionage actions instead of letting the media expose it. It reaches the conclusion that it seems more likely that Australia's intelligence agency is aware of Wang's opportunistic purposes and does not think his story has any intelligence value. But Australia finds his story valuable in public opinion. Thus, the Sydney Morning Herald, a media organisation that likes to smear China, has hyped Wang's story into an explosive story. Alex, why don't you give me some reactions before I continue on? There's not that much to go. I've got a speech from former Prime Minister Keating where he touches on the issue and a couple of other important aspects to kind of the China espionage / China in general over the past couple of months.
Look. To be honest, I don't really know what to make of it on first reaction, considering it is still a relatively recent story, and we will have to kind of wait and see what evidence comes out in the wash. However, for the purposes of analysis, I think definitely, if what the Chinese rebuttals are saying is true, then I think there could be some meat and some value to what the Chinese rebuttal is saying, particularly around the age and kind of the role that someone at kind of that age could have in an international scheme like that. However, because the details are unlikely to come to light straight away, I would say the more interesting point for me, at least, is to see the way in which people are reacting to the story. At least their initial hot take, I find fascinating. So obviously, the people who are going to jump on this story the hardest, and we know there are some even in alternative media who I assume will be well and truly down the Chinese throat for this story.
You going to give a shout out to anybody?
I'm going to give a shout out to Tim Wilms, who I know will be chomping at the bit to really rip into this story, considering he has quite substantial hesitations about the role in which China plays in geopolitics, etc.
Tim Wilms from the Unshackled.
Tim Wilms from the Unshackled, who has published a number of, who's been very good to us. But I'm sure he will be listening to this podcast and making our take on it. I'm hesitant to jump to a conclusion on this one, particularly so early in the piece.
It's hard to jump to a conclusion. I would lean towards believing at least some of what Mr. Wang is saying, not least because after going public with it, he's on the China hit list. Like, there's a range of, in the same way that Assange would probably be on the American hit list, Mr. Wang would be now on the China hit list. And it would not be surprising if, Wang has committed much worse crimes than Mr. Zhao, who woke up dead in a hotel room. And it's not confirmed that it was China who did it, but it would not be surprising. It's like he can't really go back to China. He might have family there. Best case scenario is if he gets, detained, he might get executed if he goes back.
The only rebuttal I would have to that is that there is actually some security in going public with these type of things. So you can see Mr. Zhao, who didn't actually go public. It was only once he was found deceased that the details became relevant, that he was that it became known that he filed a formal complaint to ASIO. So obviously ASIO is not going to publish formal complaints. They're not in the business of publicising that. So I think actually going public actually does provide you with a small element of security, because I think the Chinese government would be done.
Sure, that's what I'm saying. Is that it actually puts pressure on the political establishment to give him political asylum. There was another aspect to the story I had to leave out because this story was just too long. That there was a guy working for the Chinese Consulate General in 2005 who defected and basically became an informant on Chinese government to Australia, who was given political asylum, I think after going public. But anyway, one other interesting point to note is that he hasn't been granted political asylum yet or political protection as such from ASIO. The Chinese article makes the point that if they took his allegations seriously, they would give him protection. But if he hasn't been given protection, he hasn't been given asylum, then maybe they're not. I think it is interesting that they've picked up two people in Taiwan who are who are directors of China Investment Innovation Limited, or whatever it's called. And I think hope that might shed some light on the story. It would be interesting if he actually has any details about, like, specific details about other intelligence operatives, about his more specific details about his role in Hong Kong, how exactly he was trying to influence the Taiwanese elections. The media reports, when they broke, all described these like big major developments, but we didn't actually get a lot of tangible information. Now, there's a chance that ASIO has the tangible information and we don't have it, relating to the bookstore kidnappings, influencing Taiwanese elections, etc. But a lot of the criticism from pro-China outlets is that he hasn't really offered any new information. He's just played on existing information and attempted to position himself. We don't have access to that information, although the rest of the two Taiwanese is interesting. The other thing I would say is that it does not surprise me at all that, I would be very surprised if, John, fix the camera. I would be very surprised if China did not have a wide network of spies in Australia, as I'm sure Western countries would have a wide network of spies in China. I think there's probably a lot of spies around the place. I also think that it would not surprise me at all that China would use Hong Kong listed companies to act as a front for Chinese intelligence operatives in Hong Kong and Taiwan. That seems like a relatively, don't want to say rational, but if you are acting in the pursuing of the interests of the Chinese state, it seems like a logical thing that you would do. So, it doesn't seem like a far-fetched story in that sense. I would say that I would tend, my gut feeling is what I have to go off here. Hasty really backs him. Hasty wants to give him political asylum here. But I think that I don't know exactly what to make of it at this point. I think his age is a tough one for him because he would be quite young, and to be involved in those operations. But at the same time, he might be.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to continue this story unless you have something you want to say before I continue it.
Yeah, but you can go. That's right.
Okay, so
I'll let you have it.
Keating made a speech recently. Former Prime Minister Keating, and what he said, I'm going to give you kind of some highlights from his speech. Keating said that the media had been, quote, up to its ears in promoting phobias of the national security agencies. The Sydney Morning Herald has, one of his things he said was that the Sydney Morning Herald has 2 anti-China stories in the paper. Quote, it's the usual shock and awe indignation, all fundamentally fired by alarm at the scale and speed of China's rise. Now, I don't like it when the Global Times comes out and just says that Sydney Morning Herald is an anti-China newspaper, right? And that's the same thing that Keating is doing here. Like, it might, often have anti-China stories in it, but as having that as like the first liner at the start of your speech, I don't think is helpful, right? It's just trying to bias the readers towards one thing or another. And the reason why I say that is because the 2 stories he was referring to was, one, a release of 400 pages of internal Chinese government documents about the Uyghur detention camps. So they're almost like the kind of Pentagon files or something. But these
Papers.
The Pentagon Papers. But these are
the Vietnam War.
These are the Xinjiang documents, or the Xinjiang. I'm going to be trying to read them. So I got them, and hopefully I'll be able to bring you some analysis if I can read the Chinese. We'll see if I can. But so anyway, exposed the unprecedented detail of China's crackdown against Muslim minority groups. That's a significant story, and I don't think that's fair to say that's just anti-China, right? The New York Times broke that story. It was broken basically on every major news source in the world. That's a significant story. I think it's kind of disingenuous for Keating just to say that's an anti-China story. The second story was Chinese efforts was an allegation by the premier of the island of, I want to say Malaita, Malaita, which is in the Solomon Islands. So the premier of that island made allegations that the Chinese government had made efforts to pay off politicians in the Solomon Islands. They offered MPs $200,000 in bribes to switch diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to Beijing, according to one of the Solomons, according to this guy, Suidani, Suidani. So there's a range. If you don't know, after the Civil War, where the Chinese mainland became the Chinese Communist Party, the party that the communists were fighting against all fled to Taiwan, and that's actually why if you go and visit the Forbidden City in China today, it basically has a fraction of all the valuable stuff in it that it had before 1949, because I think it was the Kuomintang KMT who was fighting the communists. When they all packed up and left Beijing to go to Taiwan, they took most of the valuable stuff out of the Forbidden City and took it with them. So Taiwan has its own Forbidden City with heaps of artifacts in it. But anyway, so what that means is that Taiwan tried to establish themselves as kind of Taiwan or real China, and mainland China tried to establish itself as real China. And I think there's still a few places around the world which don't recognise mainland China run by CCP as the one China or the one China policy, and some recognise Taiwan, which evidently the Solomon Islands do. Now, if you remember back, I think when Donald Trump, on the day he won the election or the day he was sworn into office, he actually either accepted a call or made a call to Taiwan, which really angered the political establishment in Washington, but also angered China, because that was going against the one China policy, which the US had been kind of following, which was to recognise mainland China and not recognise Taiwan, recognise Taiwan as kind of like a state within a state. But he had a call with the president of Taiwan. And so the allegation in this story is that China is seeking to bribe officials in the Solomon Islands to recognise mainland China as real China and not Taiwan. Now, there's a chance there's some of our audience, maybe Jim Lee in the audience might be able to correct me on a few details there, but I think I've got the overall story right. So they were the two stories that Keating said were anti-China, and that's why I didn't like that bit from Keating to just say they were anti-China. I think they're significant stories that should be reported, and to say they're anti-China, it's not just like someone's fed up with too many Chinese students in our universities. It's like there's that they're kind of real stories. Now so Keating continued. He said that he said in his speech that Australia's media had failed to paint a, quote, balanced picture of the rise, legitimacy and importance of China. He said China's historical view is not rooted in ideological aspiration, universal or otherwise. It sees its legitimacy arising from its ethnic oneness and bulk and its geopolitical eminence in the Asian mainland. He continued, quote, big states are rude and nasty, but that does not mean we can afford not to deal with them, whether it be the US or China. My concern is what passes for the foreign policy of Australia lacks any sense of strategic realism, and that the whispered word communism of old is now being replaced with the word China. He finishes saying this process is not working in Australia. The subtleties of foreign policy and the elasticity of diplomacy are being supplanted by the phobias of a group of national security agencies which are now effectively running the foreign policy of the country. What do you think about Keating's speech? There's two more. Oh, sorry. I'll finish this. So we talked a little bit about the Xinjiang documents. So the Xinjiang, the political re-education camps of what they call them, really, they're detention camps. were established after Islamic violence peaked in China in 2014. Followed a string of unrest and terror attacks in Xinjiang, which is the majority Muslim province in China. Now, the Embassy of China in London did a response to the Xinjiang Papers story, which was published by the New York Times. The Embassy of China in London said, first, there are no so-called, quote, detention camps in Xinjiang. Vocational education and training centres have been established for the prevention of terrorism. Second, the trainees take various courses at the vocational education and training centres, and their personal freedom of the trainees is fully guaranteed. Third, there are no such documents or orders for the so-called detention camps. And the so-called leaked documents are pure fabrication and fake news. They actually said fake news, which I thought was
interesting.
Was interesting. So, a few more things I'll say about Xinjiang. One is that, as far as everyone can tell, they are really detention camps. When I was in Shanghai in July, August, I met with the Australian Financial, as part of a Sydney University trip, I met with the Australian Financial Review's China correspondent called Mike Smith. He was part of a group of journalists that was invited by the Chinese Communist Party to go and do a tour of the Xinjiang education camps. Now, this is like several years after they'd been established, and they walked around, a bunch of journalists, and they walked around, I think one of the camps, got to talk to a few people. Now, they said, obviously, the camp experience was totally inauthentic, fabricated, didn't really feel at all like it was one of the camps that they kind of felt like they knew was there. They said that the people who came and talked to them were almost like robots who were just really pretending to be happy, like they were under orders, and they had really strict guidelines about where they could and couldn't go, like where they could explore, where they couldn't explore. And there's as well, there's been some aerial photographs released of what look like whole massive groups of people, all in like courtyards, like tied up, I think. And it's a pretty concerning situation there. Like, if you're a foreigner, like I could not go and visit Xinjiang, where I could go visit a lot of other places. It'd also take like a really special visa for me to go and visit Tibet, which is another like sensitive location in China. But so I'll try and read the Xinjiang Papers and get back to you with the story on that. That's basically the end of the story. I had to cut a lot of it out, but so you have the death of Mr. I want to say, it's Zhao, right? Death of Mr. Zhao in his Melbourne hotel room. Nick Zhao. You then had Wang Licheng talking about his role in the booksellers, Hong Kong universities, Taiwan media, Taiwan elections, and Australian espionage ring. And then you have the Xinjiang Papers, which had been released. Do you have any reaction to that overall? Keating's statement. What should we do about Mr. Wang before we wrap up the story?
It's a big story. There's a lot to digest. There's a few things definitely I think that we should talk about. Related to Mr. Wang, I think I am beginning to operate, I reckon, probably with a little more skepticism than when I first heard the story. I think there definitely are a bunch of things that don't stack up. Particularly, I think the Chinese newspaper, whilst you could definitely say it's biased and definitely authorised by the party, certainly makes some reasoned rebuttals, particularly surrounding kind of his age and his experience. Because, for example, if foreigners aren't allowed to work, basically, aren't really going to be able to find a job in China unless you have 2 years experience following a degree in China. So there is this, or a master's degree, basically. That's the minimum before you can get a job in China, before anyone will hire you. Basically, there is quite a culture in China of getting your secondary education and kind of establishing some kind of area of expertise before being hired. Full stop, first thing. Second thing I would say is that also what you can see is potentially, just from my first skeptical look at the set of facts, is that I think the particular criticisms that the Post had about the way in which if ASIO was actually genuinely concerned about it, they wouldn't have. They would be conducting their own counterintelligence.
Well, they said they are investigating it. Well, ASIO said publicly they are taking the allegations seriously. Well, the Chinese newspaper said that if they were taking them seriously, they wouldn't let him go to the media.
And I think that's probably fair enough. Number two, I think there are a bunch of competing and conflicting interests here. So the fact that these two Chinese nationals have been caught up in Taiwan, when you have a situation where the president of Taiwan is basically anti-Beijing, even if there is nothing to these two Taiwanese nationals, even if there is absolutely no evidence, it absolutely.
So I think they're Chinese nationals being held in Taiwan.
Sure. Yeah. But it absolutely serves the purpose of the Taiwanese president to have these two people in Taiwan, publicise that they have it in Taiwan, under investigation for potentially meddling in the Taiwanese election or having some kind of influence over the democratic process there. It absolutely serves that purpose. In the same way here, that although even if ASIO didn't really think that the Wang or the Chinese really had, there was really any evidence to link them to kind of meddling in Australia or in the surrounding areas, whether that's Hong Kong, Asia Pacific, etc., it absolutely serves the purpose of the intelligence organisation to operate under the public fear that there is kind of a deep existential threat coming from Beijing, from China. Absolutely, that serves another purpose. I think your point about Keating was correct in the sense that him labelling document leaks as anti-China only serves to show that what's actually in the document leaks doesn't look good on China in the first place. And so that if anything, the reaction actually is accurate. Because if you're saying from a government official document leak that the report is not flattering.
What he's saying is that there's an atmosphere of anti-China generated by the media rather than being generated by facts, as far as I could deduce what his overall argument was.
Sure, but the direct quote and the quote that you've got here is that the City Morning Herald has two anti-China stories.
They're not anti-China in the sense that they are. He was saying that they're anti-China in the sense that, well, it could go either way, but you just keep choosing anti-China or you just have an anti-China bias. He's saying it's anti-China bias. This is anti-China facts.
Okay.
Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get a little bit, but I still think it's difficult to...
Well, I don't think Keating is agreeing with you at all. I think Keating was bashing the Sydney Morning Herald. He wasn't praising the Sydney Morning Herald for revealing to us.
Sure, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that he was giving the Sydney Morning Herald a pat on the back. I'm saying that the fact that he's deducing from the fact that the Sydney Morning Herald has reported on a document leak, that the document leak itself was anti-China, not so much the reporting.
Sure, saying that those reports are anti-China in the same way that talking about the Confucius classroom is anti-China are two very different things. Like people criticising the Confucius classrooms, that's regarded as anti-China, but that doesn't have a factual basis.
Sure.
But then this seems like this has a factual basis, and those are two different anti-Chinas. In fact, they're like opposites.
Of course. I'm with you on that.
Okay, cool.
So that's what I'm saying. Keating deserves a little bit of a spray for it. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
But he's also... Keating on the one hand wants to talk about kind of an elasticity of diplomacy and the way in which we should kind of approach these things with nuance. His nuance is the fact that he's largely pro-China and potentially wants to downplay any kind of risk that the Chinese associate, that is associated with the Chinese influence in Australian politics, etc. But I think the more interesting point is that whilst... Let's just say, for example, even if Wang was what he says he is, and that everything that he says about the Hong Kong elections was exactly as he says it is. I don't think that from that point you can definitely say that China is especially bad, that we should approach China with a level of skepticism that is different to, say, the way in which we would approach the US, or which we would approach the United Nations, or any other kind of vast, powerful international body. Because if anything, the evidence demonstrates that basically anyone who is trying to influence elections. Anyone with a vested interest in oil or minerals or anything like that will absolutely be looking after our own interests. And I absolutely would not be surprised if, to the extent that we were able to, Australia was also trying to influence geopolitical outcomes, particularly in the Asia Pacific, but also globally, I would say.
Yeah, I would say I have 2 points to make. The first is that I think people are worried because probably in the last 100 years, Australia's been, even though we would be widely regarded as a medium power, probably still the dominant power in the Asia Pacific region. And now that through China's growth, we're looking at being almost like a big brother that's been outgrown by a younger brother as they reach adulthood. Not to draw any links, but so Australia's got a funny place in the Asia Pacific, and when you've got China, which is has much more resources, has a much bigger military, has probably a much bigger spy network. Australia just geographically is vulnerable, particularly when it's seen as, I would say, the oasis of Western liberalism in the Asia Pacific. Along with New Zealand, but New Zealand's effectively a part of Australia for the purposes of this discussion.
Same way, which
so is Tasmania. Is that I think there might be a special fear of China in that sense, that Australia is a medium power, and although we have a big status, we're just outgunned in terms of manpower. And so there's probably a nervousness that we don't have the defence. We can't defend ourselves from China where we could previously defend ourselves from everyone else in the Asia Pacific, either militarily or in intelligence. And that leads on to a second point, which is like, well, if it comes to the point where we have to choose between, do we want to kind of be, do we have to choose between China and America, right? Because there might be a time where we do. Now, I'm hoping we don't have to. But it seems like at least the media wants to kind of pivot towards America, which is interesting considering they all hate the American president. And so it seems like there's a building of tension between the kind of Western liberal democracies and whatever you'd say China is. Communist dictatorship is probably the easiest way. Now, the only other thing I would say is that although the truth of it is much more muddy, we at least like to pretend that we have a separation of like state and economics, for instance. That we try not to let let's say private financial incentives influence public administration. But in China, the two are almost interlinked. Like China has a state interest in most big Chinese companies, and although they're privately run, they're basically government. They're government controlled in the sense that if a government person tells you to do something, you have to do it. Otherwise, if you're polluting too much, Chinese government officials are just going to come in and start smashing down your factory with sledgehammers, and there's nothing you can do about it. But in like Australia or America, that can't really happen, or we pretend it doesn't happen, or it happens to a much less extent. It happens less than China, let's say. That, I think, is a fact which makes people scared of Chinese influence in particular, as opposed to like American influence, right? Because it's not like the American, or it's just to a lesser extent that there's like kind of vying for domination or supremacy in terms of geopolitical preeminence and like economic dominance. Like it just, I'm finding it hard to articulate my point, but I think China, especially because it's got its economics interlinked with the organs of power in the state and military, people are especially concerned that if something wrong was to happen with the Chinese government and we are reliant or vulnerable to the Chinese government, then it's that Chinese power doesn't have any checks and balances which we might be able to rely on or fall back on in the same way that a president could get voted out in America or an Australian Prime Minister could get voted out. They don't have those same internal checks and balances. So if someone there becomes a bad egg, let's say, then we might be especially vulnerable. If that made sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. If you frame the question as a question of we're ultimately going to have to choose, then absolutely it poses a bunch of particularly stressful corollaries, you'd almost say. But I don't really subscribe to the view that we're going to kind of have to choose at some point, because just to the extent that there are so many, whilst there are kind of, let's just say there are three main superpowers between Russia, China, and the US. Between the three of them, each of them have their own competing interests. And
India's coming up.
India, and so you have the balance, and like, I don't think it could ever really get to. It would be very, very difficult for me to imagine a point in which we would have to choose number one, but number two, framing the conversation at this point when we definitely don't have to choose right now, I think is far more problematic than addressing that issue down the road when it comes, if it has to. I think as soon as you start framing the issue as, well, we're going to have to choose at some point, we might as well choose now, I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I'm saying that is one trap you can fall into if you believe that at some point you're going to have to choose. And I know that some people potentially in the media are a big fan of that. I think that's far more problematic than kind of riding the bumps now. So that's what I would say about it.
Okay, I reckon we're on to the next story.
I think we're on to the next story. We're going to try and keep this one quick, but we need to give a shout out to our friend, ally in the fight for truth, Julian Assange. So Julian Assange, if you don't know him, is the founder of WikiLeaks, which is a not-for-profit news organisation which has rose to prominence primarily by publishing leaked government documents. So not just from one area or from one era, but has published across the geopolitical spectrum, across several years as well. I believe it was founded in, I think, 1998 or something like that. It was founded.
From a lot of different governments they've published.
That's exactly right, Dougal. At different times. So
different eras.
Different eras, different epochs. So
different minutiae.
If you want to have a look at what happened to Julian Assange, you can kind of get into it. But the thing that mostly set him off was that he published, by consequence of an analyst in the defense force, I guess equivalent in the United States, who's now named Chelsea Manning, who before was not Chelsea Manning, was a boy, but we'll refer to her by Chelsea Manning. Leaked a bunch of documents relating to the Iraq war logs in particular. And so what happened after the leak of the Iraq war logs is that the media coverage of such an important geopolitical event, I hate using that word, but
why are you saying it was so important?
The reason why the Iraq
war logs.
Well, it was because it challenged the prevailing narrative that was being purported by the mainstream media organisations that it was not only was it a just war, but it was also the way in which it was carried out was along international guidelines. It was a fair war, that the only reason that kind of any ascendance was being gained by the US or the US allies was that it was due to superior tactical nous and
I'm just saying, what do you think, for someone who's not familiar with them, what's the type of stuff that was in it?
Okay, so for example, the Iraq war logs shows footage from an attack helicopter in which a whole bunch of civilians get butchered, despite, including two journalists, despite it being absolutely apparent that potentially the people that they were targeting was not there. But they shot at this, I think it was a vehicle to begin with, and then kind of fanned out. They shot with kind of a reckless abandon and had very little sympathy / very little kind of process stop gaps to ensure that damage was mitigated where it could be. And so there was a bunch of other things, but basically there were a bunch of what would be now considered kind of war crimes which were committed by active members of the United States Army whilst overseas, which certainly challenged the prevailing media narrative and that which was ideally purported by the military-industrial complex writ large. So Assange publishes those documents after Chelsea Manning leaked them to him, and by consequence, he was thought he would be extradited to the United States from where he was in London. So he was in London, and then he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. So he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2010. Now, in 2012, sorry. But just prior to that, 2 years prior to that, he had been facing allegations of rape charges in Sweden. Those rape charges have hovered over him since, whilst the entire time I should cover it. There were no charges. The Swedish authorities wanted to speak to him relating to an incident of rape, and there were rape allegations. However, no charges were ever filed.
My understanding is he also offered to go and meet with them at the place where they asked, as long as he was given assurances he would not be extradited to the US, where he would face trials for leaking the documents, and those assurances were not given to him. So he didn't turn up for the interview, and then he got charged for not turning up to the interview. So there were no actual charges ever related to the rape. Yeah, they were related to like contempt of court or not coming to court. Well, that's why he's in jail now. Well, for those for not showing up, I think.
For not showing up to his court appearance. But so he was charged and he was sentenced and jailed to 50 weeks for breaching his bail conditions after going into hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for nearly 7 years in order to avoid extradition to go into the US. So because he knew that he would be extradited to the US, he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. By consequence of that, he broke his bail, so to speak, and so that as soon as he left the Ecuadorian embassy, or rather, as soon as he was kicked out of the Ecuadorian embassy, he was arrested. Okay. So Assange was jailed for 50 weeks in May for breaching his bail conditions after going into hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy. So over sex, in order to avoid extradition to Sweden over sex offence allegations, which he has denied. So he's totally denied the whole thing. However, Judge Deborah Taylor, so recently, as of this week, Sweden has finally dropped the charges formally. So they actually dropped it first in 2017, so that was a period of 7 years, because they said that the evidence was insufficient enough, as well as a substantial time had lapsed. The testimony of the witnesses was growing weaker, their memories were worsening, as well as 7 years they felt that basically they couldn't prosecute.
He's basically in a jail anyway.
He's in a jail anyway, but the problem is, so they closed it in 2017, but then as soon as he's released, as soon as he walks out of the Ecuadorian embassy, they refile again. So they refiled it, but now they've dropped it again. So now they've dropped it again. Several months later, they've dropped it again. So
But he's in jail for not turning up to the court appearance on that, because he wasn't given a guarantee of not being extradited to America to face the military courts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, what's interesting So Assange is scheduled to face his extradition hearing in February. Okay, so what's interesting is that he has been sentenced to 50 weeks basically for breaching his bail conditions. But what's absolutely fascinating, so he gets sentenced to 50 weeks, and after more than 70 members of the British Parliament, 70 cowards in the British Parliament signed a letter to support his extradition to Sweden if authorities there requested it. What's interesting is that 2/3 of knife crime offenders in the UK currently don't go to jail. So if you commit a knife crime in the UK, you don't go to jail. But if you publish documents that were leaked to you, you go to jail for 50 weeks for breaching bail, basically.
Same thing with Tommy Robinson. The law can be very selectively applied.
It was absolutely selectively.
One other thing that's come up recently about Assange is that more than 60 doctors have written an open letter saying they fear Julian Assange's health is so bad WikiLeaks founder could die in a top security British jail. Now, I don't know if this is as top security as the top security they were holding Epstein in, but
it's a little bit more secure.
This guy's thin. He hasn't seen the sun in about 15 years or something, probably 10 years. Maybe just on a balcony, but if they wanted to kill him, they could probably just let him die in jail, judging by his health, because he hasn't been outside for so long.
Yeah, well, so when the judge was Judge Deborah Taylor was assigning and sentencing Julian Assange for his breach of the bail conditions, she said, interestingly enough, quote, "As far as the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention opinion is concerned, this is not binding on this court. And as is apparent from the ruling of the Chief Magistrate, with some personal knowledge of the matters relied upon, it was underpinned by misconceptions of fact and law." So basically, UK magistrates who are activists who moonlight as judges are all about human rights, and they're all about protecting the rights of the innocent and the underprivileged and the misaligned and the mistreated, up until it gets to a point at which it affects their own or establishment interests. So that's exactly what you see. So despite the fact that more than 60 doctors have written an open letter saying that Julian Assange's health is so bad that he could die, and despite the fact that he hasn't seen sunlight basically in 7 years, that he's a shadow of what he once was, and not only this, when at one of the pre-trial hearings for his extradition, when they're setting the date for the extradition hearing, they asked him, "Do you understand what is going on?" Because obviously you have to have the mental awareness to participate in the proceedings. He said, "Not really. I can't think properly. I don't understand how this is equitable. This superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case, and I can't access my writings. It's very difficult where I am to do anything, but these people have unlimited resources." So, if extradited to the US, he will face 18 charges related to espionage. 18 charges. So, what do you think, Dukes? I mean, obviously, the Assange case is a big case in and of itself, but particularly with the Sweden dropping the charges after 7 years.
Well, I mean, it's the cruel injustice of the law that Epstein gets popped in a top security jail. Assange is in jail, and bloody Prince Andrew's walking around smashing underage birds. Like, it's the world we live in. It's the world we live in. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's not much to say that hasn't already been said. I think it's pretty disgusting. A whole lot of cowards. I think there's a whole lot of cowards in the Australian government who don't get wrapped as much as they should. I think Barnaby Joyce said something the other day that Australia should do more to support Julian Assange, because that's underreported, is that he's actually an Australian citizen. Like, we're having these discussions about whether returning ISIS fighters should be allowed back into Australia, but you've got a guy who's publishing truth, facts, information about a war in the Middle East, and Australia's doing sweet FA to help him. In fact, they're probably contributing to him staying in jail because there's a whole lot of Australian deep state actors who got severely embarrassed by the Iraqi war logs. Now, I've got a secret hope that he'll get extradited to America and Trump will presidential pardon him, but I reckon that's he might, assuming he's still alive at that time. I've got haven't got a lot of hopes.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things is that the failure of the journalistic community to really rally behind Julian Assange.
Let me pause. The guy I met in Shanghai, I said to Mike Smith, after he went to the Xinjiang camps, right? And he goes, "Yeah, I don't really believe them in Xinjiang. Like, we have to find out what's actually going on. Like, they're holding up people's freedoms." So I said to him, "So what do you think about Julian Assange, considering he did to the American government what you are hoping to do to the Chinese government?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, well, us and the journalistic community are still having a discussion about whether Assange is a real journalist or not."
Yeah, well, he's a beta. There's no question. The fact
he gets a beta mail.
He gets a beta mail nomination, but this is interesting. So if you go on to WikiLeaks and you look up Julian Assange extradition, or you look up Julian Assange, WikiLeaks says this in the opening paragraph, quote, on the 15th of July 2019, documents revealed that Assange had used the Ecuadorian embassy to meddle in the 2016 US presidential election and had met with Russian and various other hackers from around the world to do so. Now, the documents that it's referring to is actually a CNN beat-up article, and the CNN article basically said this in the first paragraph. New documents obtained exclusively by CNN reveal that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange received in-person deliveries potentially in bulk of hacked materials related to the 2016 US election during a series of suspicious meetings at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Okay, so when you go onto WikiLeaks or when you go onto CNN and you type in Julian Assange and you're expecting some kind of journalistic integrity to be maintained throughout the article, so even in the introduction, just in the introduction would be nice.
Just one sentence.
Let's just do one paragraph of honest reporting, just one, okay? And the thing is that there's actually no evidence that Julian Assange himself meddled in the US election, okay? He did not do it, okay? He did not, with Roger Stone or with the Russians, hack the DNC server to release the information related to John Podesta and Hillary Clinton and all that stuff. He did no hacking.
In fact, we have a good idea who it actually was. It was a little boy named Seth Rich with a USB who then... What happened to Seth Rich?
What happened to Seth Rich, yeah? Okay, and so whenever you hear, there was Russian meddling in the election, what they're actually referring to, if they're honest, if they were actually serious about the actual meddling that occurred, was $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, which basically kind of semi-directed people towards Trump articles, okay?
Or they're referring to the leaked emails from the DNC server, which showed Hillary getting questions from Donna Brazile from the CNN debate. Or how they conspired with the delegates to rig the DNC primaries against Bernie. But what they're actually referring to was the publication of their own misbehaviours.
And so when they say, the Russians hacked the DNC server.
Well, they say the wokest people say the Russians hacked the election.
Hacked the election. There's no actual evidence besides the CrowdStrike report. So CrowdStrike were the people who the DNC, which is a private contractor, by the way, which the DNC pays, okay? So if I pay Dougal to come and investigate how I got hacked, okay, despite the government wanting to know about it, and I said, don't worry, the government, you don't have to look at the server. Dougal's looked at the server, okay? That's what happened. CrowdStrike is to the DNC what Dougal is to me. Already working together, been working a long relationship together. The FBI never ever got a look at the servers. Okay, the CIA, the FBI, DOJ, no one got to look at the servers except Dougal. Okay, Dougal was the only person, and then Dougal says, it was the Russians who done it. And then the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN all say that the Russians hacked the election. Julian Assange facilitated it. They had a whole bunch of top secret meetings with the Russian officials. And everyone assumes that Julian Assange is now a war criminal, okay? He hacked the election, he published war logs, he's apparently a criminal. He is not. He's not the guy you go after. The only reason people hate him is because he made a whole bunch of really powerful people look dumb, especially Hillary Clinton.
Especially because Hillary Clinton was the one who was done in bed with the Russians. Look up Uranium One scandal. Hillary... instrumental in selling 20% of America's uranium to Russia, despite the fact America takes part in NATO, which is a military alliance composed of America and other strong European countries to stop Russia being military powerful. And Hillary then goes and sells 20% of America's uranium to Russia after a Russian Kremlin-linked company made a lot of donations to the Clinton Foundation, which Clinton was actually... supposed to disclose, but never disclosed these donations in particular. And the interesting thing for the nuclear physicists who are in the audience is that uranium is actually the key ingredient in a damn nuclear weapon. And so if you're in the military alliance to stop Russia getting military powerful, and then you sell 20% of your country's uranium, who's in direct competition with Russia, after a whole lot of undisclosed donations to your personal foundation, you want to know who's in bed with Russia. It's not actually difficult to find out.
It's pretty funny. So the best thing about these type of stories is actually looking at the way the media reports it, and one of the funniest things I always see is the fact checkers, the people who do the fact checking.
Dude, the fact checkers suck. Dude, can I tell you one story about the fact checkers? So I was looking at this the other day. Donald Trump said in a tweet that more British Muslims had gone to fight with ISIS than were in the British Army. Okay, and that got fact checked, and I'll recall you briefly what the fact check said. Now, there were over I think there was different reports. One said that over I think 12 or 1300 British Muslims had gone to fight for ISIS, and that was the report Donald Trump was referring to. The Guardian fact checked it and said it wasn't actually 1300; it was more like 700, and although that you are correct saying there's only 500 British Muslims in British Muslims in the British Defence Force, the fact that not all 700 went to join ISIS, some might have joined Al Qaeda or Al Shabaab or the others,
like El Nusra,
and also considering the fact that some of those had probably died while they were fighting, it seems probable that at no one time were there more ISIS fighters who were British Muslims than British Muslims in the Defence Force. And so Donald Trump got fact-checked. Okay? That's the type of fact-checking we're dealing with. It's insane.
Yeah, so I mean, you look at the Uranium One deal, and you go onto Snopes. So the claim is that the Hillary Clinton approval of a deal to transfer 20% of uranium deposits to a Russian company was a quid pro quo for donations. Their defence is multi-layered, but they say it was actually pretty closer to 10%, and that during the same time that the acquisition took place, the Clinton Foundation accepted contributions from 9 individuals associated with Uranium One, totaling more than 100 million. And that's so the 100 million isn't 145 million as someone claims. So that is debunked. Wasn't 145 million. It was only 100 billion, and it wasn't 20%. It was 10%.
As we hear so often, Trump is a liar. Man, that's. Anyway, I reckon this could be our most informative episode so far.
There was a lot of your story was quite dense. It threw me at the beginning, and then it threw me at the beginning of the Assange story. But we've ramped up. I think we've gotten the bits we wanted to get out. But I think the lessons. If we're gonna, what would be your top takeaway from today's stories?
Firstly, although he was nice at the meeting, and I don't want to damage Usage relationship, I want to say Mike Smith's a bitch. AFR correspondent, he's getting a Beta Male of the Week nomination. I want to say we should maintain a healthy scepticism and healthy optimism in regards to Australia's relationship with China. I'm a big fan, hoping that we get it going. I've lived in China for 2 years. I know Chinese. I'm going to be back in China in a little bit. We'll probably spend a portion of my 20s working there. Big fan of living in China and my experience there. So I want to say I'm probably more pro-China than most. I think that there's not much you can say about Assange except it just represents the worst type of failures of the worst type of people who occupy significant levels of power within the democracies in allied Western countries. I actually want to know what Prince Andrew's been doing. I walk around all day wondering why there's not a massive investigation to Prince Andrew. If I was Prime Minister Scott Morrison or Trump or basically any other world leader, I would probably be blackmailing England right now and saying, I need you to give me something, whatever it is, unless otherwise I'll go on a media tirade against the Buckingham Palace for. Well,
I assume that's exactly what everyone is doing. Basically, I assume that's the only reason Trump hasn't already come out and taken the palace for ransom is because he actually is already. Right. But that's one of the dangerous things is that one of the biggest, actually, if we're going to digress a little bit, one of the biggest points in Assange's favour is that one of the benefits of having top secret information like that out in the public is that people can't use it as leverage in backroom deals. basically. So, I mean, if you're a country in the Middle East that's looking for CIA training to fund some extremists, and you happen to come across information, or you happen to have hacked into the NSA, or you've hacked into the Defense Force, and you come across that video of an Apache attack helicopter butchering civilians, that's something you can actually use to get some really dangerous and bad stuff out of. That's something, and the people who are actually way down the bottom of the food chain, the furthest down the bottom of the food chain is the ordinary punter, the person who's paying for the war and will ultimately be paying paying the piper if any of those consequences come back. So
probably is paying the piper because if you're an American, you probably know people who in the military have gone and fought over there.
For sure, and I don't regard, like, it's interesting after talking to some people who are really anti-Assange, who have power.
Small BDE.
Is
SDE.
Is that kind of in the fight for freedom and the fight for truth, it's really, as much, it's the people who are able to both go along with it and the people who have like a really visceral hatred towards him, which is the most surprising, like, particularly within the journalistic community and the people who are in media and stuff. Like, when we have had these conversations with people who are like that, it does make you double take a little bit, I think. And
it does. I think though that's what we got to give to people today. I think it's go look a few things up. Go search down a few rabbit holes. What happened to Seth Rich? What happened in Uranium One? What happened in the Iraq war logs? What happened with the Xinjiang files? Go take a look. Tell us what you think.
And if you're still a big fan of big government, then come back next week.
Now we've finished the podcast with talking about jumping to conclusions. I said the era of Tinder's over, the era of Hinge is upon us. People have this podcast has gone on for a while, so I'll keep this pretty short. A lot of people have the brand recognition of Tinder as the main online dating app, but Tinder doesn't work compared to what the other apps are bringing, right? Tinder swipe left, swipe right, you usually only see the first photo. What's kind of innovative about Hinge is that you have a profile with like 5 photos on it, and then you are required to answer at least 3 questions. It's something like, change my mind on, or like, this to win me over, you should, or like, choose between these 2 dates, or my weird talent is whatever. And then you actually have to go through either one of the photos or one of the answers to the question. You click the like, and then you have to write a short message about the thing you liked and send it to them, or you have
to answer one of their questions, or
their question, and so your message gets sent back to them associated with that piece of information or the photo that you liked. Now I've got I might even read you out my profile for those little for those people who want to go, take their online dating experience to the next level. I think you're looking to portray in your profile kind of fun, easygoing, but still interesting, socially aware person. So I can't show you my photos, obviously.
Dougal's dating tips. Maybe we can do that.
I've had that suggestion before. People should say you should do Dougal's dating tips. Okay, so I answered 3 questions. Keep it light-hearted, but kind of funny. So, first question, I'm weirdly attracted to, then you have to say. My answer is Kim Possible.
She was dumb thick.
She was dumb thick. I said, my most controversial opinion is, this is probably my least controversial opinion, because my most controversial opinion would have probably banned me off the damn platform.
Did you lie on this platform?
It depends if you count this as a lie. I said Hawaiian shirts are appropriate for all occasions.
I think you lied there, but
that was a lie. But
I reckon your most controversial is that Seth Rich got murdered.
well, it could be. I did say that to somebody who said that their thing was, tell me something I don't know. I said Seth Rich didn't kill himself. And then, believe it or not, and then I say speak Mandarin. That's just my little plug. Hey, I'm cool, cultured. Slide in these DMs, baby. Anyway, I'm saying that's a superior dating app. It's the dating app of the future. You're going to be hearing about it a lot more. It's the one the girls are on. It's the one that the guys are on if they're socially in tune.
What do you reckon the split is? What do you reckon the split guy to girl split total numbers on Hinge?
You're talking me personally? About 1 to 1 million?
It's the odds of you getting a date.
Alex actually dropped me off on a date the other night. I picked him up a little ice cream sundae on the way.
I had a chocolate sundae from Mackie D's with the flake. Thank you. I think
he's the type of operator to, when he knows I'm buying it for him, to ask me for a flake.
You're the type of operator to at 6:45 say, can you drop me off somewhere at 7?
Well, man's got to hustle.
Okay, Hinge split, guys, girls.
Anyway,
doesn't matter. But
we'll be back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Instagram. We've just did a really cool merch drop. We didn't actually wear it today. That's a bit disrespectful to the merch drop that we didn't wear because we did make the rule.
You know, it's just lazy.
We did make the rule to wear our own stuff.
It's not exactly a great endorsement.
It's disrespectful to the game, but it's really cool. It makes you look real big and thick. We've got a tank top and a t-shirt. ConachouseProductions.com. Feel free to. We've also got like news articles on there. Some opinion pieces. Alex is getting an article about Dietrich Bonhoeffer up soon. The Boon Man with the Boontang. And if you really like our content, you can find us on Patreon. You can donate to us as little as $1 a month. We really appreciate it. That's it from me. Have a great week. Go out, young kings, explore the world, dive down some rabbit holes, come out on the other side, have a big gasp of fresh air before the deep state takes it away from you.
Yeah, go out with peace and love, with love in your heart and peace in your soul and an open mind is what I would say. But be ready to
fight the deep state
and conquer something. Conquer something every day. I reckon if you can conquer one thing, one personal best, or beat one thing that you haven't beaten before, I think that's a good outcome. Not what?
Well, nothing. Just make sure it's the thing you beat is not you. Make it something else.
Making sure it's not a person or your family or someone you care about. But yeah,
or something you care about. Anyway, Alex missed a joke.
I assume you're talking about beating your meat. That's what you're talking about, yeah?
Anyway,
don't beat your meat every day. That's what you're saying.
We're gonna
insightful. That's what they pay the Patreon for.
See you soon back on the channel. Thanks for being on the Rap 30.